Hi everyone, welcome to week 2. This week we will be continuing our teleological approach to an exploration of business and business ethics, except we're going to focus in a little bit more than we did last week. Last week the readings and discussion that we had was at a kind of general level, talking about business itself and how to think about it as an artifact, and how you can develop an account of business ethics by looking at it through a teleological lens. This week we're going to focus in on a particular type of business institution. So we're going to narrow our focus. We're going to use the same approach we've used so far, but now it'll just be as regards a particular business institution. In this case, the corporation, and even more particularly, the American corporation. Later in the course, we're going to do a similar thing for a particular business practice, namely employment at will. So you've got a number of readings this week, and actually you have 2 PowerPoints to look at. The narrated PowerPoint for the Jones and Phelps reading is separate from this. This is a very quick PowerPoint. Is to cover the Stout essay mainly and how it is connected to Friedman. I wanted to give you a little bit of historical context in terms of thinking about Friedman's argument for the social responsibility of business. And the Stout reading is intended to respond to one of the 2 arguments that Friedman gives for his claim that the social responsibility of business is to increase profit. If you recall from last week, as we were working through Friedman, I described to you and asked you to look for 2 separate arguments in the Friedman essay. One we called the ownership argument, and the basis of that argument from Friedman is that shareholders are owners of corporate assets, and since they're owners of corporate assets, corporate managers have responsibilities to the shareholders to not tax them without their consent by using corporate assets, financial and otherwise, in the pursuit of social or public goods. So that was one of Friedman's arguments. The second argument that he gives is the argument that the pursuit of an increase in profits ends up promoting overall social utility. And you'll get a little bit more of that in the second PowerPoint slideshow for this week. So this one, we're going to focus in on Friedman's ownership argument and how Stout responds to that. Now, to place Friedman's argument in a little bit of a historical context, as I mentioned in some of the discussion responses last week, it hasn't always been the case that we have thought of corporations as the property of shareholders, and we haven't always thought of corporations as entirely private types of institutions. When corporations first start showing up on the scene in the U.S. In the 1800s, and in particular following the Civil War, to form a corporation, individuals had to literally make an individual appeal to state legislatures to allow to be incorporated. We didn't have general incorporation laws back then. So, for example, if you wanted to form a corporation to dig a canal or to operate a steamboat system on a particular river, you would have to go to your state legislature, whatever state you were in, and you would have to show that, if allowed to incorporate, you would be able to produce more efficiently and more quickly than the state could some public good. And these public goods tended to be like canals, trains, other types of sort of public goods dealing with transportation. So you had to show, in the historical context for this, is that states back in those days didn't have at their disposal a great deal of tax dollars to engage in these projects. So you would go to your state legislature, ask to be incorporated, you would be granted that, Typically what would occur is you would be granted a monopoly over, say, canal building in the state of Washington for X number of years in exchange for the right to incorporate. And almost all of the early American corporations were aimed at creating or constructing or providing some kind of public good or public service. So early on, corporations, when they first started showing up, actually functioned as kind of quasi-public institutions. As the 19th century begins to wind down and we head into the 20th century, our view about the social good that corporations promote begins to change. And socially, we begin to view the generation of wealth itself as a public good. And you can imagine that along with the generation of wealth itself, a range of different public goods are served. You have an increased tax base. Typically, you got increased employment. You have greater products and services available. So this is when general incorporation laws begin to pop up. But again, the thinking was this, that since the production of wealth itself is good for society, we want to foster as much of that as we can. And if corporations are a particularly good type of device or instrument to do that, we want to allow for as many of them to exist as possible. So we see a huge rise in the number of corporations in the U.S. as we head into the first part of the 20th century. But this left open the question of how these corporations are to be managed. For most of the first part of the 20th century, corporations followed a model that's typically referred to as managerial capitalism. And actually, if you did a kind of close scrutiny of corporate law these days, to a great extent, this is still the case. But the idea behind managerial capitalism is that managers are given a great deal of latitude in how corporations are to be managed. You get emerging this idea that corporations are to be managed not just for the benefit of the public, but also for the benefit of the corporation itself. And so managers had a great deal of latitude to make decisions about how corporate assets are used. You have the rise of the business judgment rule. As long as managers are making a decision which they can justify based on an appeal to sound business judgment, they are immune in case their decision turns out to be mistaken. So we arrive at the 1970s, and the piece you read from Milton Friedman, and you can well imagine that under a kind of managerial view about corporations, shareholders' interests aren't treated as anything special. The interest of shareholders isn't given any greater weight than the interest of various other types of stakeholders that you have in a corporation. But shareholders wanted more, and that's not too hard to imagine. They wanted greater control over how corporations are run. And the question was, how do you do that? And this is the period in time in which you have the rise of what's come to be known as shareholder primacy. This idea that corporations are to be run primarily in the benefit of shareholders, and that the primary interest that shareholders have is a maximal return, either in terms of their share value or the dividends that they receive. And this is where Milton Friedman enters the picture. Milton Friedman, along with others, argued that the best way for a corporation to be run is to be run along the lines of shareholder primacy. This is when you begin to encounter more and more the claim that shareholders own corporations. They're the owners of corporate assets, and therefore, of course, those assets, because they have a private property right over them, ought to be managed so as to benefit them. So that picks up momentum in the 60s and 1970s and became and still is the dominant view about corporations. If you ask someone in the general public, Joe Q. citizen, they'll tell you that yes, shareholders own corporations, they're the owners of them, and corporations are to be run primarily in their interest. And as you're going to see when you look at the Stout piece, you even read legal scholars making such a claim, although it turns out to have far weaker grounds in the law than you would expect. But the point of all this is to make sure you understand that again, since corporations as a particular kind of business institution are artifacts, there's no quote-unquote natural way in which they are to be run. We have to decide how they are to be managed and whose interests they are to be governed. And so we can, again, think in terms of this teleological approach that we've been working with. So that's the context for thinking about Friedman's view regarding corporate assets being the private property of shareholders, and that corporation is to be managed primarily in the best interest of shareholders. Now, the Stout article. Lynn Stout was a professor of law at the University of Southern California, but a few years ago she moved to Cornell University. And over the years she's done a lot of work regarding this legal notion and, as it turns out, this empirical idea of shareholder primacy. So in the piece you have, and this comes from a book that she authored where she critiques the myth of shareholder primacy, she's focusing in on Friedman's ownership argument. So make sure you understand that that's what she's up to. She's trying to show that the legal and, for that matter, the empirical basis of Friedman's claim and the idea of shareholder primacy is pretty weak. And in particular, her primary focus is on the principal-agent relationship. And you'll have to pardon the misspelling of principal in this slide. It should be P-A-L. And she wants to know, is this actually present? Is it actually the case that shareholders are principals and corporate managers are agents? And she does a good job of sketching out in 3 or 4 steps what the argument is, what the assumptions are behind that view. And then she gives you some reasons to think that each of those assumptions are pretty weak. So the idea would be, if Stout is right about all of this, and Friedman's ownership argument is not well grounded both in law and the empirical reality of how corporations are in fact run, then that opens up the question about, well, in whose interest should a corporation be managed? That opens that question back up, because the claim that corporate assets belong to shareholders as private property, if it's a weak argument, if it doesn't hold up empirically in law, then we can ask, well, in whose interest should corporations be run? And if just generally, if you just think about it a little bit, when we typically think about private property owners, the idea is that if you own a piece of private property, you have a great deal of control over who accesses it. But if I'm a shareholder and supposedly I own corporate assets, there are a number of things I can't do, which your typical private property owner can do. For one, I can't just walk in to say I own some stock in Microsoft. I can't just walk into Microsoft and pick up a stapler and say, well, I own this because I own X number of shares of Microsoft and they're worth this amount, so I'm going to take this piece of property and that piece of property. I can't even ask that the user or the manager of my supposed private property, the corporate assets, generate a return for me on them. As Stout points out, shareholders only get dividends if the board declares dividends. They can't demand them, as it were, in each and every instance. And just one other thing to think about. Shareholders don't get to decide what executives are paid, what managers are paid. Now, the board, CEO, they determine that pay. So again, if they really did have control over corporate assets as private property, you would think they would be able to exercise far more substantial control and power over that than they actually can. So as you go through the Stout piece, it's pretty straightforward. I don't think you need a great deal of guidance from me with this piece. Again, make sure that you're focusing in on what she's saying about the basis for thinking about the relationship between shareholders and corporate managers as principal agents, and why the evidence for that is pretty light. So there you go. I will end this better than I ended the first slideshow from last week. Again, if you have any questions about the Stout essay and how it connects up with Friedman as you're going through it, or as part of the response to the prompts that I'm going to put up on the discussion board, please let me know.